Lords, I thank the noble Lord Bird for securing this debate and introducing it in his typically powerful, inimitable style. However, I'm afraid I do have to disagree with the noble Lord that poverty is a characteristic of individuals, families or communities. It's a condition imposed on individuals, communities, families, cities and countries by an economic system that directs large amounts of resources to the few and denies them to the many. People are robbed of the shared resources that have been created by past generations and that are maintained by the labour of the current, the labour that's many of the people who are now living in poverty. If we think back to during the COVID pandemic and the focus on essential workers, the delivery drivers, the people standing in supermarkets and stacking supermarket shelves, the care workers. Those essential people, many of their children are those who are living in poverty. And I'm afraid I also have to disagree with the noble Lord about social housing. Decent housing is a human right, and it should be an essential service provided by our society. We've almost forgotten that back in 1979, almost half the British population lived in social housing. Back then, the rate of poverty in 1979 was 13.7%. Today, 2023, the figure is 22%. And the destruction of social housing is a significant factor in that. But I do want to actually address the term child poverty, because we've become used to the word poverty coming with a qualifier. We often talk about food poverty, about energy poverty, about period poverty, about hygiene poverty. There's a risk with those qualifiers that we lose sight of the essential situation. We have a society that's riven with poverty, lives right across the age groups, blighted by the inability to access the basics of a decent life. The State of Ageing report released last November showed that 20% of retired people do not have enough income to meet their basic needs. 25% of people aged 60 to 64 are living in poverty. That pretty well matches the figures that have been already cited for children. 1 in 5, 2.6 million in total, are living in absolute poverty before housing costs. 1 in 4, 3.6 million after housing costs. Now, there will be many in this House who, if asked to define a successful economy, would use that hoary old chestnut, gross domestic product, and point to the growth from 2010, when the current governing party came to power, of 1.87 trillion. That was the GDP then. And now the 2023 figure is 2.27 trillion. Apparently that's a sign of progress and success. Yet I and the Green Party say that the job of our economy and society is to meet everybody's basic needs, while the caring for the environment on which all of our lives and the economy depend. If we'd use that as a judgment, what a failure the growth has been. And so why is that the case? The noble Lord Bird challenged us with the why. Well, I'm going to use the D word, distribution. We have a society that profoundly misdistributes our resources, not to mention destroying our environment. Growth over decades has benefited the few, while the lives of the many have gone backwards. The root cause of child poverty, is our failure to fairly distribute the goods and services of which our society has plenty. The failure is of our current economic system, our benefit system, the failure to maintain and support the basic physical and social infrastructure in our communities. There are, however, many reasons why child poverty is a particular tragedy. Anyone now under the age of 18, a child, had no part in creating the system they have to live in. Anyone under the age of 22 has had no say in our Westminster politics, yet they live every day with the consequences. They suffer not just from poverty, but and not just from a lack of access to resources, but a lack of access to power. And that poverty is defining the shape of their bodies and their lives. As the head of an education trust in East Yorkshire, John Utley of the Education Alliance reported, what does child poverty mean? It means going to school hungry, regularly. It means not having the money for lunch. It means not being able to wash your sports kit. It means being unable to sleep at night because of cold. And how do you study the next day if you haven't been able to sleep? Now, I think it's important to draw on the work of the Centres for Cities, acknowledging how this maldistribution is regional as well as by household. Looking into the child poverty figures, it found the cities where they are the worst are overwhelmingly concentrated in the north of England and the Midlands. A child in Burnley is 4 times as likely to be in absolute poverty as a child in Cambridge. A child in Manchester is twice as likely to be in absolute poverty as a child in London. Yet we've had growth, lots of growth. So we need a plan to tackle child poverty, to tackle poverty. We need to acknowledge first a failure of our economy, the failure of our society, and at its base, the failure of our politics, not just over the last 14 years, but over decades. Power and resources are concentrated here in Westminster. Westminster has failed. The politics, the ideologies since the Second World War have failed. I would say that we need a new kind of politics and a new political system. And given I have a minute more, I am going to focus on one particular issue a number of noble lords have already raised, which is the 2-child benefit cap. 6 out of 10 families affected by that have at least one member in work. Almost half are single parents. Half, if we continue with the current plan, half of families with 3 or more children will be in poverty by 2028 29. That's up from a third in 2013-14 when the policy was introduced. A case study, Frances in London. Her 3rd child was a baby when her relationship broke down. She now has children aged 11, 6 and 3. She's had to leave her job because she couldn't afford childcare. She was a business administrator. She was not in any way a classic person in poverty, yet now the 2-child benefit limit is putting her in poverty. So the noble Lord the Minister has already been challenged on this. I'm afraid I'm going to challenge the Labor front bench on this. Surely, in government, Labor will have to abolish the 2-child benefit cap.